Garnett, who is really the most important expert on the questions, the legal dimensions of the questions that you all have been enjoying in this really beautiful documentary. And then also Rick's law school. Were you contemporaries in law school?
He's much younger.
He's much younger. Despite Rick's great beauty, he's quite elderly. But in any event, we have a very special guest, Thomas Lehrman, who is the executive producer of this important and special film. And I'm going to begin with just a couple brief questions, maybe one question each, and then we'll open it up for conversation amongst ourselves and with the panelists. But before I do that, I wanted to congratulate Thomas and also Rick, who was instrumental in this film, on producing something so compelling, because it's not just intellectually rich, because it's intellectually very compelling and it's in the discourse of the film, but even more so, I think it teaches with what it shows as much as what it says, namely, and especially at this particular fraught moment in our nation's history, where everything is polarized and everything is coded as left or right or conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat. The beauty of this film, this documentary, is that it shows that religious freedom and free exercise can't be coded in that way. It provides the conditions for goods and practices that are essential for all people, no matter what your perspective is, no matter what your point of view is, whether you're religious or whether you're not religious. And that, to me, is an essential message that we should all take on board, and is an enormous contribution of this particular documentary. So I'd like to thank both of you all. So let's start briefly with Thomas. Thomas, you were the executive producer of this film. What was it that compelled you to make this documentary at this particular moment?
Well, thanks, Carter, and thanks, Rick, for being here. First of all, I'd like to say, this was a major team effort. A lot of people were involved in it, but in some ways, this film begins here at Notre Dame Law School, because I was very influenced, actually coming out of law school myself, by Seamus Hassan, who was the founder of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. And when I was working in Washington, D.C. at the State Department, got to know Seamus and the team at the Beckett Fund, and was really inspired by the mission and the vision that Seamus had put forward. And he was a student here at Notre Dame Law School, and I believe his father-in-law was also on the faculty. And so I owe a great debt of gratitude to Seamus for helping me understand the significance of the issue, and then also getting me involved in the work of the Beckett Fund. Also, I noticed when I was at the State Department, you can't help but notice that the religious freedom issue is not just an American issue, but it's an international issue. And when you're working at the State Department, you realize if you weren't already grateful for the free exercise of religion that you enjoy in the United States, you're especially grateful for it when you encounter the lack of it in many countries around the world. As time went on, again, I continued to be involved with the Beckett Fund and thought there was an opportunity to do something in this area, in part through a friendship that I developed with Rick Brookhiser, who was introduced to me by my dad. My dad and Rick Brookhiser had been friends since, I think, the early 1980s. So I owe a debt of gratitude to my mom and dad for introducing me to Rick. We had worked on a separate project before this. And then I said to Rick, I think there's a real opportunity to do a documentary on religious freedom. He had written a book on the history of great documents in essentially in the tradition of American liberty. So those are a couple of the friendships and relationships from which this documentary came. Many other people that I don't have time to thank either inspired this or contributed to it in some way, shape, or form. So especially my wife, Mara, who's sitting up there. Mara.
Thank you so much. Rick, I have a question for you as well before we open it up more broadly. As Americans, we typically think in terms of individualism. We think about our rights. We think about my right to free exercise. Could you say something about the rights of institutions like the University of Notre Dame, for example? What are their rights and interests? And you talked in your remarks in the film about living with integrity as an essential good that is protected by free exercise. Could you say something about how to think about institutions and free exercise?
Well, I do think one of the great things about the documentary that Thomas put together is that it does highlight the reality that religious freedom, correctly understood, richly understood, is not only about the relationship between a solitary lone individual and the distant state, but it's also about all kinds of mediating associations and congregations and institutions that kind of fill up the space of civil society. So if you think about our documentary, institutions like the Underground Railroad, which is a kind of institution, institutions like the Catholic schools that Dagger John Hughes set up, which helped facilitate the entry of new immigrants into American society. Institutions like the organizations that came together to bring about some of these legislative changes that we heard about, such as the Civil Rights Act. These were groups. They weren't individuals by themselves. And one of the things that religious faith has done in America, and also I think in many other places, is it provides a glue for meaningful human association, which then can be leveraged into political action. So it's such an important thing to appreciate. And from that, we can say, if you want to understand religious freedom and do it correctly, our religious freedom laws need to be attentive, again, not only to the needs and claims of individuals, but to the rights of institutions to govern themselves, of denominations to pick their own ministers, pick their own teachings. And obviously this has a lot of relevance in a lot of court cases today, whether it's a university, a hospital, a school, or what have you.
That's wonderful. And one other point that you make all the time, Rick, and Thomas, it's made in the film is, and on several occasions, is the free exercise is not just about the freedom of belief or private prayer or private reflection, but in fact, being in the world, heeding God's call, realizing your vocation in a way with the integrity that reflects the goods that you're committed to. And for a church like the Catholic Church, where we run hospitals and schools and universities, that has a special significance. So let's open up to the audience for questions and conversation. And we often like to take the first question from students. So if there's a student with a question, we would recognize you, but if not.
And I see we're following good Catholic tradition to have everybody sit in the back.
Yeah, exactly. But this being a law school, don't feel comfortable because I will call on you. Is this oh, you just made a physical gesture. Okay, go ahead and tell us who you are and then ask your question.
Hi, my name is Gwendolyn Loop. I'm the third-year Polking Fellow for the DeNicola Center here at the law school. My question relates to, well, it's a predictive question, which lawyers often hate, but it relates to the impact of foreign policy on our domestic atmosphere and where you see the US going, especially with foreign policy now in the Middle East, this rhetoric of a holy war, the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the US. Where do you see grounds for hope, and where are perhaps some concerns that you have going into the future for religious liberty and these conversations in the US?
I think both our panelists who have something.
Sounds like your wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, again, it's been a long time since I was at the State Department. I certainly do not speak for the State Department here. I'm just a private citizen.
I'm glad that's
clear. And yeah, just making sure that no one had any illusions about that. Well, I do think, and this was actually, sometimes they're kind of fun little backstories on as you were building the film, what were some things you thought about putting in that you didn't? There was a short segment where we talked about after World War II, the UN Declaration Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and how that in fact enshrines freedom of religion and free exercise of religion in an international document. And so that's sort of the influence of the US Constitution being projected through a document that, almost basically all the countries of the world are adhering to, at least in some shape or form. So I think that document continues to offer a sense of hope and opportunity with respect to religious liberty, because it's something we can always come back to after the cauldron of World War II. Obviously, in specific situations, there are going to be threats to religious liberty, whether that's in the Middle East or in other countries in the Far East. But I do think at least not only the U.S. constitutional tradition, but also the UN Declaration on Universal Human Rights offer a real hope. And then I would also say there's some more recent statutes as well as annual reporting by the State Department that calls out, violations of religious freedom that are worthwhile for the U.S. government to be taking notice of and taking action against. So there's a lot of infrastructure, if you will, that's been built out over the last 75 years to try to make sure that religious freedom is not just here in the United States, but also guaranteed abroad.
We have a colleague here at Notre Dame in the Department of Political Science, a guy named Dan Philpott, whom many of you probably know. He has a wonderful book called God's Century that speaks to your question, I think. And one of the things that he and his co-authors did, it's quite a project, is they sort of organized and plotted out, 2x2 matrix like political scientists like, countries with reference to how integrated religious and political institutions are, and then also how kind of peaceful that arrangement is, whether it's antagonistic or cooperative. And so you can imagine there being a country that's like, it's very theocratic, but neither side likes the other one, or it's super duper secular, but maybe the religious people don't like it. And one of the things that Dan and his colleagues figured out is that to the extent that religious actors are welcome in the public square, that they're active in the public square in politics, but at the same time enjoy institutional independence from the state, so they're distinct, that combination, right? So not secularist, but not theocratic, that combination associates well with all kinds of good political and social outcomes, with democratic health, with social stability. In the movie, you saw some bald guy say something like religious freedom is sort of like clean air and clean water. It's kind of a public good. One of the things that Dan and his co-authors found is precisely that religious freedom is a kind of political good. And that's something that, again, that's not unique to the United States. That's something you can observe around the world. Now, I do think that America has provided a kind of healthy example of this, right? Sometimes we've misunderstood what church-state separation means, but appropriately understood, it means that the church is free and independent. It doesn't mean we have a naked public square or an anti-religious form of, aggressive secularism. That combination tends to bring about good results wherever it comes into play around the world.
Yes, tell us your name.
Yes, my name is Minte. I'm a 1L at the law school here.
Welcome.
I think the documentary did a very good job kind of celebrating the gains in religious liberty we've made over the past couple of centuries. But I think I want to kind of throw a curveball here and ask some of the other side of things where religious groups enjoying religious liberty are not using that to become better citizens as a public good, as it were, but to kind of hog it as a private good, not to share the benefits with other groups. Like you see certain groups, more or less on the conservative side, kind of self-segregate into a certain area, start changing the zoning restrictions and whatever, and basically drive other people who are not of their group outside of that area. And I think this happens it's not limited to one religious group, right? I think a couple of instances have happened across the United States. So I'm wondering where we could safely draw that line between religious liberty as a public good versus when it's starting to go into this is too much privatized and it's kind of crowding out the public good.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? Others may know what you're referring to, but I'm ignorant of the example that you were alluding to. Could you give a little bit more detail on the zoning example?
I think there's a couple. There's, I think, to some extent, St. Mary's in Kansas, where this traditionalist group went in and made life very difficult for other people. There's also a Hasidic suburb in New York, I believe. And I'm sure there are other examples that I'm not aware of as well.
Well, maybe Rick is definitely the one to answer this more than I am. One thing I would like to say, and hopefully you'll watch the missing episodes or segments of the film, there is a segment on the Mormons, and there's also a segment on the Quakers in the film. We obviously omitted that so we could have some time for conversation. But the Mormon segment obviously deals with really an interesting question, right? Which of course is polygamy and plural marriage. And how does the United States deal with that problem of free exercise, but coming into contact with longstanding traditions in Anglo-American law and essentially the peace and good order of the community, as is spoken of in the Reynolds case. So that might be an interesting episode for you to watch, to just to be assured that we've dealt with some of those topics historically as well in the film in the full version.
Yeah, I mean, as I think Professor Amar made this point in the video, but the way American religious freedom law has developed is that, the right to exemption or the right to accommodation or the right to religious practice is not and has never been absolute. So there are going to be limits, and some of those limits are going to track what it sounds like some of your intuitions are, which is that, if a particular religious practice were actually damaging to the public good, that was undermining what Professor Amar calls a compelling state interest, then even under the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, it can be limited. Now, when you use the word private or privatizing, I'd want to be clear about something. I don't think it's a threat to our national political life, and I don't think it's a problem for religious believers to form communities, right? So think of, there are Amish communities near South Bend here that are somewhat more homogenous than, those of us who come from really diverse urban centers might be used to. You mentioned the town of Kiryas Joel in upstate New York, which is basically entirely made up of Satmar Hasidim, who for religious reasons have formed a close-knit, tight community, because for them, the expression, the Amish and the Yoder case that you saw is another example. For them, in order to live out their faith, they need to have these close communal ties. And I think a pluralistic democracy like ours can tolerate communities and pockets like that. That's not a threat to our overall national unity, it seems to me. Again, there's going to be limits on how far these things can go. But I think in a truly pluralistic society, there's nothing wrong with having particular communities that are relatively integrated, and some might use the word homogenous, but that sounds bad. I don't think that's really the right word. It's kind of like, if you think about diversity in higher ed, Notre Dame contributes to diversity in higher ed precisely by being meaningfully and distinctively Catholic. You wouldn't want every institution in higher ed to be exactly the same. And I think similarly, we can have a legal order of religious liberty for all, and sort of have a national context that's very pluralistic and diverse, while still having some communities that are relatively close-knit and kind of singing this from the same hymn book.
Yeah, just building on what Rick had to say, I think this is also maybe an opportunity to think about the First Amendment in its totality, not just the free exercise alone and isolated from obviously freedom of press, as well as the other part of the freedom of speech, but also the other part, which is the right of peaceable assembly, right? And that's kind of a test, are the exercises, free exercises of religion, those that are connected to peaceable assembly? Or is there something intrinsically violent or some sort of violent threat to the community associated with the gathering of that religious community? And that's, I think, where the compelling state interest would definitely come in.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Margaret. I'm a senior in the undergrad. So I was wondering, I noticed that the film focused on many points in history where religious liberty was kind of tested, or where, especially, I appreciated the examples of the founding with abolition, and the debate over whether or not to even include a Bill of Rights was very kind of centered around religious liberty and the Baptists. And I was wondering if in the course of making the film, were there more historical examples that you discovered or learned about but didn't choose to include, or just more examples in general?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are so many cases one could, I mean, this is really hard when and not only is the question of like, are there more examples, or what cases you talk about? Rick Brookhiser was very insistent on like, this can't become a legal case book. It can't be like a series of like, because we just will bore our audience. So we had to kind of find a bit of a sort of happy balance as filmmakers in making it a story that would be interesting, not only hopefully folks at a law school, but also a broader audience. So yeah, there were many cases that we thought about. In the end, I think hopefully we struck the right balance. Between sort of the broader historical questions. The other interesting question was just, how do you organize a film like this? We didn't have to organize it around religious groups. That we could have organized it either chronologically or done some other way of organizing it. And that ultimately, one of the reasons we thought that might be helpful is that many religious communities are intimately familiar with their own challenges of achieving religious liberty in America, but they're not particularly familiar with those of other communities. So if we highlighted that this question of religious persecution and challenge is not unique to one group in America, but it's affected many groups throughout American history. The other case I mentioned was the Quakers, which is in the colonial period. We could have spent more time on the Catholic question in Maryland. We alluded to it very briefly, but there's a fascinating history of just how did religious liberty develop in the sort of pre-Declaration of Independence world of the United States. So,
yeah, in the extended dance mix of the film, that's dating myself, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Quaker story is fascinating though, because really early on, people, I know it's kind of jarring for sometimes people to learn about it. I mean, in the 17th century, some of these brand new American colonies that we sort of celebrate as having been, havens for religious dissenters in a heartless world, they were hanging Quakers, and so the full film presents some of those examples as well.
I would also say there are some more contemporary cases, which probably are things that law students here deal with respect to vindicating religious freedom today. We were a little concerned about doing too many contemporary issues, in part because it might be unfairly, politicized or maligned as being a political issue. So what we tried to do was focus on those stories that seem to have both very significant connection to the broad sweep of American history, but weren't necessarily too focused on the contemporary topics of today. Allow people to discuss those in classrooms and in their homes. We didn't have to necessarily to go touch all of those cases.
Hi, I'm Emma Kate. I'm a third-year law student here at Notre Dame, and the film showed an example of the Jehovah's Witnesses who wouldn't want to salute to the flag, and how the Supreme Court, decided one way and then later on changed their minds. And then the film also showed or gave the example of the Native American who wanted to smoke peyote as a some of his religious practice. The court decided against Smith in that case, but it was later Congress who kind of responded and, I guess flipped the decision. So I was wondering if you could speak to maybe why the court was able to recognize their mistake in the flag case, but not Smith.
Well, so the flag case history is just fascinating. I mean, it's not unheard of, but it's relatively common for the court to kind of flip on itself. But this was, within fewer than 2 years, really. And it wasn't really because of changes in personnel. Sometimes the kind of cynical explanation is that when Gobitis was decided, we had no idea that we were going to win World War II. It was before the Battle of Midway. Things aren't looking so good. By the time Barnett is decided and Justice Jackson writes the majority with all this stirring language about freedom, not only did it look like we were going to win, but also the war, it had become increasingly clear, I think, to some of the justices, including Justice Jackson, who would later go on to the Nuremberg tribunals against the Nazi officers, that the war really did have this kind of ideological / philosophical dimension to it in his mind. That one of the things that the war was being fought for, and one of the things I think he wanted to encourage people to think about the war in these terms, was that it really was being fought sort of freedom against authoritarianism. So that's part of the narrative. No doctrine changed. It just they changed their mind about how necessary it was for national unity to require kids to say the pledge. In the first case, the concern was if kids are opting out of the pledge, it's going to undermine unity, that'll undermine the war effort. By the second case, Justice Jackson feels comfortable saying, efforts to achieve compulsory unanimity only achieve the unanimity of the graveyard, right? Good stuff. With Smith, it's a little complicated. This is where I'm kind of the heretic against all my friends at the Beckett Fund that you saw on TV. I actually suspect that the Smith case was rightly decided. And I also love it that Congress came in just as Smith invited it to do and passed a statute creating legislative exemptions. So the debate in Smith versus RFRA is not a debate about whether we like religious freedom or whether accommodations are good. What was at issue there really was the role of courts in creating exemptions as opposed to legislatures. And as it's happened in the 30-something years since the RFRA was enacted, courts have been much more willing, some would even say aggressive, in giving religious believers accommodations than they were before Smith was decided. It's played out that way. Religious claimants win more often under the RIFRA than they did under Smith. But you can still see a similar dynamic of kind of one thing happens and then there's a response as part of kind of a national dialogue. Here it was Congress responding to the court, and states have done likewise. In Barnett and Gobitis, it was kind of the court in dialogue with the nation about what the nation's needs for unity were.
Yes, gentleman here.
I'm Gary Simpson. I'm a member of or a fellow in the Inspired Leadership Initiative, ILI. I just go by the initials. I have several questions, but I'm just going to ask one. And I have one little comment on your Universal Declaration. You probably know this. The person who wrote Article 18, the religious freedom article, was actually a professor of religious formation. And the story behind that is a pretty interesting one. And like I said, you might know this one. Here's my question. The film is beautiful, by the way. I went to parochial schools and so did all three of my children. Starts off by acknowledging the kind of coming together of religion and the Enlightenment. You actually use the phrase Enlightenment early on. Totally dropped out of the rest of the story as you told it. And I don't think it's out of the story for a lot of the people that you talked about. You could just take Martin Luther King Jr., for instance, who was much influenced by the Enlightenment as well as his Baptist background, of course. So I'm just wondering what happened to the Enlightenment in your story. I mean, you could talk about Madison the same way, or Adams, or Jefferson, or a whole bunch of the founders in that way too. They bring them, including Lincoln, for instance, they bring them together.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, again, part of the film that is missing, I think, as I mentioned, the first segment is actually on the Quakers. And I think part of the core, it was alluded to in the introduction, but there's an episode on the Quakers which is missing. And one of the points that Rick Brookhiser makes, and makes it at the end of the film, is that, and one of our points is that while the Enlightenment is definitely a source for some of these ideas, that there are ideas embedded in the Judeo-Christian tradition itself, which are conducive to religious liberty. In other words, you don't need the Enlightenment to get to religious freedom. And that's in fact the justification that's given. So it's not meant to give short shrift to the Enlightenment, but I think it's also meant to show that those two streams of thought don't necessarily need to be either in conflict, or for that matter, that the Judeo-Christian tradition is lacking the resources, the intellectual resources, to provide an impetus for religious freedom.
Look at the natural law tradition of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Black natural law, Jewish natural law, Roman Catholic natural law, tradition as well. So, and the natural law traditions are drawing resources from Greco-Roman history and the Enlightenment. I mean, 30 Years' War is so critical behind all this. And you can't do everything in a movie.
So,
Rhodius, for instance.
along with two co-authors, here's a shameless plug. I've got a book called America, Religion and the American Constitutional Experiment. Maybe I should learn the name of the book. And here's an image that we use to describe the founding, which I think might be responsive. We picture like one of those tailgating tents, that's got sort of four pillars holding up the canopy. The American conversation about religious freedom is sometimes portrayed as just being like a single beach umbrella kind of thing. It's the Enlightenment and some people in Virginia, and that's it. But as Thomas just said, in fact, the conversation was taking place, again, picture the image, under this canopy that had at least four pillars to it. And we talk about kind of the Puritan / Congregationalist tradition in New England, which was very influential in driving the movement for independence in American history. Obviously, the kind of Enlightenment, maybe more deist kind of philosophical vibe coming out of Locke and so on. And you certainly see that in Madison and Jefferson. Also the Baptists, who we talked about, evangelical religion, so dissenting religion. And then a strand that I think you mentioned in passing just now is, you said Greco-Roman, but we call it civic Republican or classical, right? All four of those strands of thought were mutually reinforcing. They weren't saying the same things, but they were all kind of ships sailing in the same direction, if you want, toward America's religious freedom experiment.
Thank you.
We have time for one last question, and
it's a leading
Ken
question.
Hellenius.
I'm Ken Hellenius from the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. Thomas, you've made reference multiple times to parts that we didn't get to see. So I want to know, where can we watch that? And where can we see this to share with others who weren't able to join us this afternoon?
Well, Ken, thanks for the shameless opportunity for a plug. So just a little bit of an update. This will be appearing on PBS. I think it launches on PBS sometime in the next few weeks. And then after a run on PBS, which will probably run through December, it will be released on iTunes and Amazon and most of the other major streaming platforms. So, but we can also provide a link to whomever wants it, a private link that you can use between now and then. So happy to make that available.
Wonderful. Friends, join me again in thanking our panelists. Thank you all. Thank you.